Some people carry flowers into a children's hospital, others carry hope. Elena Bennett carried stories, never imagining that one forgotten book would make the most feared man in Chicago refuse to leave her side. Every Tuesday night, just after 7, the pediatric wing at St. Agnes Children's Hospital slowly transformed from a place filled with beeping monitors and whispered conversations into something gentler. The fluorescent lights dimmed slightly. Nurses lowered their voices. Parents settled into uncomfortable chairs with paper cups of lukewarm coffee, and children who had spent the entire day surrounded by medications and medical equipment gathered in the small reading room near the end of the hallway. It was never a large crowd. Sometimes there were 5 children, sometimes 12. On difficult weeks, only 3 little faces waited beneath handmade paper stars hanging from the ceiling. Elena never counted them. She simply smiled, wheeled the old wooden book cart across the polished floor, and greeted every child as if they were the only person in the room. She had learned years ago that stories could never cure a disease, but they could steal fear for an hour, and sometimes an hour was enough to remind someone that tomorrow still existed. Outside the reading room, Chicago's November rain tapped softly against the hospital windows, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of silver and gold. Inside, the only sounds were the turning of pages and the quiet laughter of children forgetting, just for a little while, why they were there. Elena carefully adjusted the blanket around a little boy recovering from heart surgery before opening an old hardcover book whose faded green cover showed a tiny silver garden beneath a star-filled sky. The edges were worn smooth from years of small hands turning its pages. No barcode remained on the inside cover, no library markings. It had simply appeared one morning among donated books several months earlier, and no one had ever claimed it. She liked it because the story was gentle. The children liked it because every chapter ended with hope instead of fear. "Tonight," she said with a warm smile, "we're going to visit the garden one more time." Tiny eyes brightened immediately. A little girl hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. Another child shifted his IV pole beside his chair without complaining. Even the nurses paused near the doorway whenever Elena began reading. There was something calming about her voice. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It sounded honest, like someone speaking to family. Less than 30 feet away, another elevator opened onto the pediatric floor. 4 men stepped into the hallway wearing dark tailored coats that contrasted sharply with the white walls and cheerful murals painted by local artists. Hospital staff recognized none of them, yet something about the quiet confidence in their movements caused conversations to soften as they passed. They were not loud, they did not need to be. Rafael Castellano walked several steps behind them. At 34, he carried himself with the calm precision of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions without raising his voice. His charcoal overcoat still held droplets of rain. His attention remained fixed ahead as one of his security advisors quietly explained that his young nephew had finally fallen asleep after another exhausting round of treatment. Raphael acknowledged the update with a slight nod. He visited only after dark. The fewer people who noticed him inside a children's hospital, the better. He preferred donations without photographs and help without applause. As they approached the pediatric wing, something unexpected interrupted the measured rhythm of his evening. A woman's voice drifted through the partially open reading room door, soft, patient, completely unhurried. Raphael stopped walking. His security team instinctively halted with him, exchanging brief, confused glances. Inside the room, Elena continued reading without noticing the man standing beyond the glass. Every sentence painted another piece of the imaginary garden, while exhausted children leaned closer, completely absorbed. One little boy who had refused to speak all afternoon quietly whispered the final word of a familiar sentence before Eleanor reached it, making the room burst into gentle laughter. Raphael watched the change spread across faces that had looked frightened only moments earlier. He had spent years watching people obey out of fear. He had almost forgotten what genuine comfort looked like. His eyes slowly shifted from the children to the old green book resting in Elena's hands. Something about its cover pulled at a distant memory he could not immediately place. The silver flowers, the unusual pattern stamped into the spine, the faded corner that looked almost intentionally damaged. His expression changed so subtly that only the security advisor nearest him noticed. "Mr. Castellano," the advisor asked quietly. Raphael never answered. His attention remained fixed on the book. Unfortunately for Elena, she had no idea that the forgotten story resting comfortably in her hands had once belonged to a world she had never seen, and at that exact moment, the most dangerous man in the hallway recognized it before he recognized her. The room slowly emptied as parents thanked Elena with tired smiles, and sleepy children clutched borrowed books against their hospital blankets like tiny treasures. One by one, nurses guided them back toward their rooms while the sound of rolling ivy poles echoed softly across the polished floor. Elena carefully closed the faded green book and rested her fingertips on its worn cover for a brief moment before placing it on the top shelf of the wooden cart. She had always believed that every story deserved to be returned to its place, no matter how ordinary it seemed. She had no reason to think this book was any different. Across the hallway, Rafael Castellano remained perfectly still. His advisors waited several feet behind him, careful not to interrupt whatever had captured his attention. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Where did that book come from?" None of the men answered immediately. One quietly contacted another member of the hospital administration through an encrypted phone, while Raphael continued watching Elena organize crayons, coloring books, and stuffed animals left behind by the children. There was nothing extraordinary about her movements. She straightened every chair, folded every blanket, smiled at every passing nurse. She behaved as though kindness was simply another part of her daily schedule. That unsettled Raphael more than he expected. People often performed compassion when they believed someone important was watching. Elena clearly had no idea anyone had noticed her at all. A volunteer coordinator approached with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. "Long night again?" she asked with a sympathetic smile. Elena laughed softly. "You should go home. You covered 2 reading sessions because Melissa called in sick." Elena nodded. "I will. I just want to bring these books back downstairs first." She reached for the cart and gently pushed it toward the elevator. At that exact moment, Raphael stepped away from the window. "Find out everything about the donation records for that book cart," he quietly instructed one of his advisors. "Not the woman, the books." The advisor blinked with mild surprise. Normally, Raphael asked direct questions and expected immediate answers. Tonight, his attention seemed unusually narrow, focused almost entirely on one old children's novel. "Yes, sir." Raphael finally continued toward his nephew's room, but the image of the faded green cover lingered in his mind. He had seen that silver flower embossed into leather only once before, more than 20 years earlier inside his grandfather's private library. The memory remained incomplete, like a photograph with half the edges burned away. He remembered adults speaking in careful whispers. He remembered being told never to touch that collection. He remembered one title, disappearing after a fire, that no one in the family ever discussed again. Unfortunately for Elena, she knew none of that history. By the time she returned the book cart to the basement library, her only concern was finishing paperwork before driving home through the rain. The basement storage room smelled faintly of old paper, dust and fresh coffee drifting from the employee lounge down the hall. She signed the volunteer log, returned several books to their shelves, and hesitated before placing the green storybook back into its usual spot. For reasons she could not explain, she brushed a small layer of dust from the spine, as though saying goodnight to an old friend. Then she switched off the reading room light and headed upstairs. Less than a minute later, another figure quietly entered the basement. The person wore a hospital maintenance jacket and pushed an empty supply cart that blended naturally into the late evening routine. Security cameras captured nothing unusual. Employees walked those hallways every hour. The figure stopped beside the bookshelf where the green book had rested only moments earlier. A gloved hand searched the shelf. It paused, searched again. The book was gone. Upstairs, Elena frowned as she stood inside the elevator. Something felt wrong. She looked down and immediately noticed the familiar green hardcover resting beneath her folded sweater. She had carried it upstairs without realizing it. Smiling at her own absent-mindedness, she quietly shook her head. "I really am exhausted," she whispered to herself. She decided she would return it in the morning before her next volunteer shift. The elevator doors opened onto the main lobby. Outside, heavy rain continued washing over downtown Chicago while headlights reflected across the wet pavement. Elena wrapped her coat tighter around herself and stepped into the cold night, completely unaware that somewhere inside the hospital, someone had already begun searching for the very book tucked safely beneath her arm. And less than 1 floor above the lobby, Raphael's phone vibrated with a message containing only 6 words that instantly changed the course of his evening. The book has moved with the volunteer. Rain blurred the Chicago skyline into ribbons of silver as Elena Bennett unlocked her aging sedan in the employee parking garage behind St. Agnes Children's Hospital. The green storybook rested inside her canvas tote, hidden beneath a folded sweater and a notebook filled with reading schedules. She barely remembered placing it there. Her entire body felt heavy after covering 2 volunteer sessions and helping the pediatric nurses entertain restless children whose parents had not left their bedsides in days. She started the engine and waited while the windshield wipers pushed sheets of rain away from the glass. The parking garage was unusually quiet. Most of the day's staff had already gone home, leaving only scattered vehicles beneath rows of fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Elena checked the dashboard clock. 9:48, later than she realized. She pulled out slowly, passing the emergency entrance where ambulances came and went throughout every hour of the night. Behind her, another black vehicle rolled out of the hospital garage without attracting attention. It kept several car lengths back, never speeding up, never falling too far behind. Elena never noticed it. Less than half a mile away, Rafael Castellano lowered his phone after reading the message for the 3rd time. The book has moved with the volunteer. His expression remained calm. But everyone inside the SUV recognized the silence that followed. It meant he was thinking several moves ahead. One advisor leaned forward from the passenger seat. "Do you want us to retrieve it?" Rafael looked through rain-covered glass toward the distant hospital lights. "No." "Then what are your instructions?" Rafael answered without hesitation. "Protect her without letting her see you." The advisor frowned. "You believe someone else knows she has it?" Rafael's eyes remained fixed outside. "If I know where the book is, someone else will know soon enough." Meanwhile, Elena turned onto Lakeshore Drive, with soft instrumental music playing through her speakers. She passed the familiar waterfront, where waves crashed against the dark shoreline beneath heavy clouds. She had driven this route hundreds of times, usually replaying conversations with children in her head. Tonight, however, her thoughts kept returning to the strange man she had noticed outside the reading room. He had not smiled, he had not interrupted. He had simply stood there, listening as though every word mattered. Something about his stillness refused to leave her thoughts. She laughed quietly at herself. Hospitals attracted all kinds of visitors, wealthy donors, worried relatives, volunteers. There was no reason to think about one stranger for this long. Unfortunately for Elena, someone else had already begun thinking about her. Back inside St. Agnes, the maintenance worker who had searched the basement library stood alone beneath a security camera that no longer recorded anything. A disposable pair of grey gloves disappeared into a trash bag before another phone appeared in the person's hand. "She has it," the voice said quietly. "Yes, she left with the book." A brief pause followed. "No, she does not know." The call ended almost immediately. The figure walked away without looking back. Elena finally reached her apartment building on the north side just after 10:15. It was an older brick building with narrow hallways, squeaky wooden stairs, and neighbors who greeted one another by name. She loved it because it felt real. There were no marble lobbies or private elevators, only familiar faces and the comforting smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery downstairs every morning. She climbed to the 3rd floor carrying her tote over one shoulder. Halfway down the hallway, Mrs. Donnelly opened her apartment door holding a casserole dish covered with foil. "Working late again, sweetheart?" the elderly woman asked warmly. Elena smiled. "Just another Tuesday." "You need to remember to eat something besides hospital coffee," Elena laughed. "I promise I will." A few minutes later, she unlocked her apartment, placed the tote beside the couch, kicked off her shoes, and switched on a small lamp near the window. The room was modest but welcoming. Books lined nearly every shelf. Family photographs sat beside potted plants. A framed picture of her younger brother rested on the mantel above a narrow fireplace that no longer worked. She looked at the photograph for a moment before quietly saying, "The kids loved the garden story again tonight." It had become a habit after his passing several years earlier, talking to him as though he might still hear her somewhere beyond memory. She changed into comfortable clothes, brewed chamomile tea, and settled onto the couch with the forgotten green book resting beside her. As she absent-mindedly opened the cover, a brittle old library card slipped halfway out from inside the back page before catching on the binding. Elena blinked in surprise. She did not pull it free. Instead, she smiled, assuming it was simply another forgotten keepsake left by a previous reader. She closed the book again without another thought. Less than a mile away, Raphael's security team quietly positioned themselves outside her building, blending naturally with the rainy night traffic. None of them approached the entrance. Their instructions were simple: watch, wait, intervene only if absolutely necessary, because Raphael had reached one conclusion the moment he recognized that faded green cover. Elena Bennett was no longer just a hospital volunteer. Whether she realized it or not, she had become the safest place for something that powerful people had been searching for over 2 decades. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds that turned the Chicago skyline into little more than distant silhouettes. Elena Bennett woke before her alarm, not because she had slept well, but because years of hospital schedules had trained her body to greet the day before sunrise. She brewed a small pot of coffee, packed a simple lunch, and reached for her canvas tote resting beside the couch. As she lifted it onto her shoulder, the unexpected weight reminded her of the green storybook she had forgotten to return the night before. "I almost kept you," she murmured with a quiet smile before slipping the book carefully back into the bag. The brittle library card remained tucked inside the back cover, still unnoticed except for the brief glimpse she had caught before falling asleep on the sofa. She decided she would return both the card and the book to the hospital library as soon as she arrived. Outside, the air smelled of wet pavement after the previous night's rain. Neighbors hurried toward buses with umbrellas tilted against a light drizzle, while delivery trucks filled the narrow streets with the familiar sounds of another workday beginning. Elena stopped at the bakery below her apartment building to buy a dozen fresh cinnamon rolls. Every Wednesday she brought breakfast for the overnight pediatric nurses because, in her words, people who cared for frightened children deserved something sweet before going home. The cashier smiled as she handed over the warm box. "Busy day again?" Elena laughed softly. "When is it ever not?" She never noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Inside, 2 members of Rafael Castellanos' security detail quietly watched her leave the bakery and continue toward the hospital without interfering. Every few minutes, one of them updated another team positioned several blocks away. Their instructions remained unchanged: observe, protect, stay invisible. Meanwhile, Raphael stood inside his office overlooking the Chicago River. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, while reports covered the polished walnut desk in front of him. Most of the documents involved legitimate businesses, charitable foundations, and hospital grants. Only one item held his complete attention. It was an old photograph showing a private library from more than 20 years earlier. Resting on a carved wooden shelf behind a much younger Raphael sat a familiar green hardcover decorated with silver flowers. He compared the photograph with a digital image quietly sent from the hospital archives only an hour earlier. They matched perfectly. His senior advisor entered, carrying another folder. "We traced the donation records." Raphael looked up. "And there are none. Impossible. The cart has accepted donated books for nearly 15 years. Every item was catalogued except one. That title never officially entered the system." Raphael slowly closed the photograph. "Someone wanted it hidden in plain sight." The advisor nodded. "Do you still believe the volunteer is unaware?" Raphael answered immediately. If she knew, she would not have carried it home in a canvas bag beside her lunch. Several miles away, Elena arrived at St. Agnes Children's Hospital just before 8 o'clock. The familiar scent of coffee, floor polish, and fresh flowers welcomed her through the front entrance. Nurses greeted her by name while a young volunteer helped carry the box of cinnamon rolls toward the staff lounge. Everything felt comfortingly ordinary. For the first hour, she answered emails, organized reading schedules, and returned borrowed books to their shelves. Finally, she picked up the green storybook and headed toward the basement library. As she rounded the corner leading into the archive room, she stopped. Several shelves stood partially empty. Books had been stacked unevenly across reading tables. A rolling cart sat turned sideways as though someone had searched every compartment in a hurry before trying to make the room appear untouched again. Nothing looked damaged, but everything felt subtly wrong. Elena frowned. "Hello?" she called gently. No answer came. She walked farther inside and found Mrs. Holloway, the elderly librarian, kneeling beside an open cabinet with a puzzled expression. "Good morning," Elena said. "Did something happen down here?" Mrs. Holloway sighed. "Maintenance reported a leaking pipe overnight. They said they needed to inspect the storage shelves." Elena glanced around the room. The floor was perfectly dry. No buckets, no towels, no signs of plumbing work anywhere. "Did they find a leak?" she asked. The librarian shook her head slowly. "Apparently not." Elena placed the green storybook on the return cart and turned away to help restack several misplaced novels. Neither woman noticed that the maintenance log lying open on the librarian's desk contained no overnight repair request at all. Less than one floor above them, Raphael's phone vibrated again. A single message appeared across the screen. She returned the book. 30 seconds later, another message followed, but someone else reached the library before she did. Raphael quietly stood from his chair, slipped on his overcoat, and gave only one instruction before leaving the office: prepare the car. I am going to the hospital myself. By late morning, the familiar rhythm of St. Agnes Children's Hospital had returned, but Elena Bennett could not shake the quiet feeling that something invisible had shifted overnight. Every hallway looked exactly the same. Nurses hurried between patient rooms carrying tablets and medication carts. Volunteers decorated bulletin boards with colorful paper leaves for an upcoming Thanksgiving celebration. Parents whispered beside hospital beds, while televisions played children's movies at low volume. Nothing appeared unusual, yet the basement library lingered in her thoughts. She had volunteered there for almost 4 years, and never once had she seen shelves disturbed without a clear explanation. During her lunch break, she returned to the archive room carrying a clipboard, hoping to help Mrs. Holloway reorganize the misplaced books. The elderly librarian greeted her with a grateful smile. She said, while carefully arranging several old encyclopedias, "Everything feels out of order today." Elena nodded as she placed novels back into alphabetical rows. Did maintenance ever explain why they searched every shelf? Mrs. Holloway adjusted her glasses. No. When I called facilities this morning, they told me nobody had scheduled repairs overnight. Elena stopped moving. Nobody. That is what surprised me. According to their records, no maintenance crew even entered this wing. A quiet chill traveled through Elena's shoulders despite the warm temperature inside the room. She glanced around once more. Whoever had moved these books had wanted people to believe it was routine. Before she could ask another question, a cheerful voice echoed from the hallway. "Miss Bennett, they need you upstairs." It was one of the pediatric nurses. "Room 312 is asking if story time can start a little early today." Elena smiled automatically. "Tell them I will be there in 5 minutes." She helped Mrs. Holloway finish stacking the final books before pushing the return cart toward the elevator. As the doors opened onto the pediatric floor, laughter drifted down the hallway. A little girl waved excitedly from her room while holding a stuffed bear almost as large as herself. Elena immediately felt the tension begin to fade. No matter what mysteries surrounded old books or strange visitors, the children always reminded her why she kept coming back. Less than 15 minutes later, she settled into her favorite chair beside the reading corner. Several familiar faces gathered around her with blankets wrapped across their laps. She reached for another story from the cart, only to pause. The green hardcover was gone. Elena blinked. She looked beneath the stack of picture books, checked the lower shelf, then searched the return bin beside her chair. Nothing. She frowned in confusion. She remembered placing it on the library cart before leaving the basement. Mrs. Holloway had been standing only a few feet away. Where could it have gone so quickly? "Are we reading about the Silver Garden again?" one little boy asked hopefully. Elena offered an apologetic smile. "Not today. I think our special book wandered off somewhere." The children accepted another story without complaint. But Elena found herself distracted more than once while reading. She kept replaying the moment she returned the book. She knew exactly where she had left it. Across the hospital campus, a black SUV rolled quietly beneath the covered entrance reserved for major donors and board members. Rafael Castellano stepped out wearing a dark navy overcoat that blended almost perfectly with the cloudy afternoon sky. Hospital administrators greeted him with practiced professionalism, assuming he had arrived for another private visit to his recovering nephew. None of them realized his attention had little to do with family that day. As he entered the main lobby, one of his advisors approached discreetly. The book disappeared less than 10 minutes after she returned it. Raphael continued walking without slowing. Security footage? 3 cameras covering the basement lost signal for exactly 94 seconds. Raphael's expression remained unreadable. "Too precise to be coincidence. Do you want us to question the staff?" "No," he looked toward the pediatric elevators. "Anyone searching that book already knows questions would attract attention." At that exact moment, Elena finished reading and began helping several children choose books to borrow overnight. She smiled as one little girl hugged a fairy tale against her chest, completely unaware that Raphael had quietly stepped into the hallway outside the reading room. Through the glass he watched the same calm kindness that had stopped him the night before. She listened carefully to every child. She remembered every favorite character. She never rushed anyone. For a brief second, Raphael almost forgot why he had come. Then his phone vibrated. A new message appeared across the screen. We searched the library too late. The object was already removed. Raphael slowly lifted his eyes toward Elena. If the book had vanished after she returned it, then someone inside the hospital had been watching her every move long before he arrived. And for the first time since recognizing the faded green cover, Raphael realized the danger surrounding Elena Bennett had quietly moved much closer than he had feared. The afternoon settled gently over St. Agnes Children's Hospital, wrapping the pediatric wing in the familiar mixture of quiet conversations, distant monitor tones, and the comforting scent of warm soup drifting from the cafeteria below. Elena Bennett finished helping a young patient decorate a paper turkey with bright orange feathers before walking toward the nurse's station with an empty stack of picture books balanced against her chest. She smiled at nearly everyone she passed. It was impossible not to. After years inside the hospital, she had learned that even the smallest smile could interrupt an anxious day. Yet beneath that familiar warmth, questions continued circling through her thoughts. The missing green storybook, the disturbed library shelves, the unexplained maintenance visit that had never happened. None of it made sense. She stopped beside the reception desk, where Nurse Olivia was reviewing patient charts. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said quietly. "Of course." "Did you happen to see anyone carrying an old green children's book this morning? It disappeared after I returned it downstairs." Olivia thought for a moment before shaking her head. No book, but there were more visitors than usual around the lower level. Security even asked us whether anyone looked out of place. Elena frowned. "Did something happen? Nobody will tell us." Olivia lowered her voice. "Administration keeps saying everything is routine, but everyone knows something feels different today." Before Elena could respond, a tiny voice called her name from the end of the hallway. 6-year-old Lily, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, stood beside her father holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Miss Elena," she whispered. Elena immediately knelt until they were at eye level. "Hi, sweetheart, are you feeling better today?" Lily nodded proudly. "I walked all the way from my room. That is amazing." Elena smiled. "I am very proud of you." Lily hesitated before leaning closer. "I wanted to tell you something about your book." "My book?" The little girl nodded again. "The pretty one with the shiny flowers." Elena felt her heartbeat quicken ever so slightly. "Do you remember seeing it?" Lily looked down at her rabbit, carefully choosing her words. "Last night, after story time, a man looked at it." "What did he look like?" Lily scrunched her forehead. "He wore grey gloves." Elena exchanged a quick glance with Lily's father, who simply shrugged apologetically. Children sometimes remembered details adults overlooked. Sometimes they imagined them. Elena chose not to lead the conversation. "Did he say anything?" Lily shook her head. "No, but he smelled like flowers." "Flowers?" "The white ones." Her father smiled gently. "She probably means lilies. The chapel always smells like them." Elena thanked Lily with another smile before watching father and daughter continue slowly toward physical therapy. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it refused to leave her thoughts. Grey gloves. Neither detail explained anything, yet together they felt strangely important. Less than 100 feet away, Rafael Castellano stood inside a private consultation room overlooking the pediatric hallway through a narrow glass panel. He had arrived only minutes earlier to visit his nephew, but another report now rested unopened in his hand. His attention remained fixed on Elena speaking with the little girl. One of his advisors quietly entered the room. "We identified everyone who officially entered the archive level last night." Raphael accepted the folder without looking away from the window. "And one name is missing." "Meaning?" "Someone used staff credentials that belonged to an employee who was homesick." Raphael finally opened the folder. Several photographs appeared inside. Maintenance workers, librarians, volunteers, security personnel. None immediately caught his attention until he reached the final page. A pair of grey protective gloves lay photographed inside an evidence bag recovered from a public trash bin outside the hospital. No fingerprints, no identifying marks. Only a faint laboratory report attached beneath the image. Trace floral residue detected. Raphael closed the folder slowly. The same detail repeated itself twice in less than 1 hour. Children rarely invented smells. Across the hallway, Elena gathered another armful of books before beginning her afternoon reading session. She laughed with the children, helped one little boy sound out difficult words, and applauded every successful page they finished together. Watching through the glass, Raphael found himself distracted once again by how naturally she brought calm into every room she entered. It was a kind of influence that could never be purchased, ordered, or demanded. Unfortunately for her, someone else had noticed exactly the same thing. At that exact moment, less than 1 floor below the pediatric wing, a visitor wearing an ordinary hospital identification badge quietly stopped beside the chapel entrance. White lilies filled crystal vases along the small altar, their fragrance drifting into the hallway. The visitor adjusted a pair of fresh grey gloves before disappearing through a staff-only door that required a level of access almost no outsider should have possessed. The rain returned just before sunset, covering the hospital windows with tiny streams that caught the fading light like silver threads. Inside the pediatric wing, the evening reading session had just ended. Parents thanked Elena Bennett with tired smiles, while children reluctantly handed back crayons and picture books before nurses escorted them toward their rooms. The laughter slowly disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the hospital, leaving behind only the gentle hum of air vents and distant monitor tones. Elena gathered the remaining books onto the wooden cart, still thinking about Lily's unexpected memory. Grey gloves, white lilies. Neither detail seemed important by itself, yet together they lingered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she did not know she was solving. She wheeled the cart toward the elevator, intending to return several books to the archive room before heading home. As the elevator doors opened, she noticed Rafael Castellano standing alone near the windows overlooking the city. He was no longer surrounded by administrators or advisors. He simply watched the rain falling over Chicago, with one hand resting inside the pocket of his overcoat. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Elena finally broke the silence with a polite smile. "Your nephew must be doing better. I have seen you here more than once now." Raphael turned toward her. "He is improving." His voice remained calm, measured, almost quieter than she remembered. "Your stories help." Elena looked genuinely surprised. "Mine? The nurses say he asks about reading hour every day." A warm smile crossed her face. "That is the best news I have heard all week." The elevator arrived, but neither of them stepped inside immediately. The moment felt unexpectedly ordinary, almost peaceful, despite everything strange that had happened during the past 24 hours. Elena finally glanced at him with quiet curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Raphael nodded once. "Yesterday you stood outside the reading room for almost the entire session. Were you listening because of your nephew?" His eyes rested on hers for only a moment before shifting toward the cart beside her. "Partly." He paused. "And partly because of a book." Elena frowned. "The green one?" "Yes, it disappeared this morning." Raphael did not appear surprised. "I know." Elena blinked. "How could you possibly know that?" Before he answered, the elevator doors opened again. An elderly volunteer stepped inside, smiling politely at both of them before disappearing toward another floor. Raphael waited until the doors closed once more, because that book was never ordinary. Elena laughed softly, assuming he meant it sentimentally. It was just an old children's story. Raphael slowly shook his head. "No," the words settled heavily between them. Elena searched his expression for some hint that he was joking, but found none. "I do not understand." He looked toward the rain-covered glass. "Neither did I, until I saw it in your hands." At that exact moment, less than a mile away, one of Raphael's security specialists sat inside an unmarked vehicle studying a digital scan that had arrived from an old family archive. The image showed the inside binding of a green hardcover book nearly identical to the one Elena had been reading. Hidden beneath the decorative paper lining was a narrow compartment no larger than a bookmark. The compartment had once contained a strip of microfilm. Another message appeared moments later from a private investigator working inside the Castellano organization. "The hidden compartment is empty now. It has been empty for years." The investigator added one more sentence beneath the report. But whoever removed the film never realized there was a second layer hidden beneath the spine. Back inside the hospital, Raphael quietly exhaled. "There is something I should have recognized sooner." Elena folded her arms. "You are speaking in riddles." Because the truth sounds unbelievable. He stepped closer to the book cart without invading her space. "The story you have been reading was printed as a children's book, but decades ago, someone inside my family used a handful of copies for another purpose." Elena stared at him, unsure whether to be confused or amused. "You are telling me a bedtime story was hiding a secret?" "Yes, and you believe that is why someone searched the library?" Raphael met her eyes again. "I do not believe it." His voice became even quieter. I know it. Elena looked down at the stack of ordinary picture books resting on the cart. They suddenly seemed different, as though every faded cover might be hiding another untold history. She wanted to ask a dozen questions, but before a single word left her lips, Raphael's phone vibrated. He read the message once, and the calm expression on his face disappeared for the first time since she had met him. He looked back at Elena with unmistakable urgency. "The missing book has been found." Elena's eyes widened with relief. "Where?" Raphael slowly locked his phone and answered with a certainty that made the hallway feel much colder. "Someone has already taken it somewhere inside this hospital." For a long moment, neither Elena Bennett nor Raphael Castellano moved. The steady rhythm of rain against the hospital windows filled the silence between them while distant pages turned somewhere inside the pediatric reading room. Elena searched his face for any sign that he had exaggerated what he had just learned, but there was none. His calm expression had become sharper, more focused, as though an invisible clock had suddenly begun counting down. "Someone found the book?" she asked quietly. Raphael nodded once. "Inside this building." Elena looked instinctively toward the hallway stretching in both directions. Doctors walked past with patient charts. Volunteers carried balloons decorated with smiling animals. Families gathered outside patient rooms waiting for evening visiting hours. Everything appeared completely ordinary. "Then we should tell hospital security," she said. Raphael remained silent for a moment before answering. "Someone inside the hospital already knows far more than security does." The words unsettled her. She folded her arms, partly against the cool air drifting through the hallway and partly to steady herself. "You keep saying there is something hidden behind that book, but you still have not explained what it actually is." Raphael glanced toward the nearby elevator before lowering his voice. Elena frowned. "Why not here?" "Because I no longer know who is listening." At that exact moment, less than 50 feet away, a man wearing an ordinary hospital visitor badge paused beside a vending machine while pretending to read directions on his phone. His attention never lifted toward Elena or Raphael, yet the reflection in the glass clearly showed them standing together. After only a few seconds, he quietly walked away toward another corridor. Unfortunately for him, another pair of eyes noticed the movement. One of Raphael's security specialists, dressed like a hospital maintenance employee, casually stepped into the hallway from the opposite direction and memorized the visitor's face before speaking into a concealed communication device. No confrontation followed, no alarm sounded. The visitor simply disappeared into the crowd. Except another unanswered question. Elena sighed softly. "Every answer seems to create 3 more questions." Raphael almost smiled. "That is usually how the truth works." Before she could respond, a nurse hurried toward them carrying a clipboard. "Miss Bennett, room 315 is asking for you. Tyler is refusing his medication unless you finish the pirate story first." Elena immediately looked apologetic. "I am sorry." Raphael stepped aside without hesitation. "Go," she hesitated. "Will you still be here?" he answered with complete certainty. "Yes." Elena disappeared down the hallway carrying 2 picture books beneath her arm. Raphael watched until she turned the corner before quietly speaking to the advisor approaching from behind. "Report. The visitor using the temporary badge entered through the chapel entrance exactly 42 minutes ago. Identity still unknown. And the book?" The advisor handed Raphael a tablet displaying a hospital floor map. One small storage room beside the old pediatric archives flashed in red. "Our source believes it was briefly moved there before disappearing again." Raphael studied the map carefully. The room connected to a maintenance corridor that only authorized staff could access. It was an ideal place for someone to pass an object unnoticed between departments. "Has anyone searched it?" "Not yet. We were waiting for your instruction." Raphael looked once toward the hallway where Elena had disappeared. "No police, no hospital administration. Understood. I will go myself." Meanwhile, Elena sat beside 8-year-old Tyler, who wore a pirate eye patch over perfectly healthy eyes simply because it made every adventure better. She opened another story and read with the same warmth that had first caught Raphael's attention. As she spoke, the little boy gradually relaxed, finally accepting his evening medication with only a playful complaint about pirates, never drinking anything that tasted like cough syrup. His mother wiped away quiet tears of relief while thanking Elena for the 100th time. Elena only smiled and reminded her that courage came in many forms. Watching frightened children become hopeful remained the easiest part of her day. The difficult part was leaving them afterward. Less than 1 floor below, Raphael unlocked the narrow storage room identified on the digital map. Dust floated through the beam of a single overhead light. Cardboard boxes filled one wall while old holiday decorations occupied another. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then his eyes settled on a wooden crate pushed beneath a metal shelving unit. Someone had disturbed the thick layer of dust covering the floor only recently. He knelt, pulled the crate forward, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of outdated children's books waiting to be donated or recycled. Most were ordinary. One space among them, however, was perfectly clean, shaped exactly like the missing green hardcover. The book had been there only moments before. Raphael quietly closed the crate without another word. He had arrived too late again. As he stood, something small caught the corner of his eye. Tucked between two dusty boxes lay a brittle paper bookmouse, identical to the ones embossed on the missing cover. He carefully picked it up. On the back, written in faded blue ink almost impossible to see beneath decades of wear, was a single handwritten sentence. The story only begins after the last page ends. The tiny paper bookmark rested between Rafael Castellano's fingers, as though it carried far more weight than its faded cardboard ever should have. The silver flowers printed along its edges matched the missing storybook perfectly, but it was the handwritten sentence on the back that refused to leave his thoughts. Someone had expected another person to discover it. Someone had wanted the final page to become the beginning. He carefully slipped the bookmark into the inside pocket of his overcoat before leaving the storage room exactly as he had found it. Outside, the hospital continued moving with its familiar rhythm, completely unaware that an ordinary children's book had quietly become the center of an invisible search. Upstairs, Elena Bennett finished helping Tyler settle comfortably for the evening before collecting several borrowed books from nearby rooms. The pediatric hallway glowed beneath warm evening lights, softening the white walls with a golden hue that made the entire floor feel less like a hospital and more like a place where hope was allowed to stay a little longer. She greeted every nurse by admire, a wall covered with hand-painted paper leaves made by young patients. One leaf caught her attention. In uneven handwriting, a child had written, "Stories help me forget I am sick." Elena smiled, gently touching the corner of the paper before continuing toward the reading room. As she rounded the corner, she noticed a distinguished man she had never met standing beside one of the hospital's donation displays. He appeared to be in his late 50s, dressed in an elegant charcoal suit with a silver tie and polished shoes that reflected the hallway lights. A small white lily rested in the pocket of his jacket. He smiled warmly as she approached. "You must be Miss Bennett," Elena slowed politely. "Yes, Adrian Vale. I oversee several charitable programs that support this hospital." Elena shook his hand. "It is nice to meet you. I have heard wonderful things about your reading sessions. That is very kind of you." Adrian glanced toward the children's library. "Stories have a remarkable way of preserving things people would otherwise lose." The comment sounded perfectly ordinary, yet something about the way he emphasized the final words lingered in Elena's thoughts. Before she could respond, another volunteer called her name from across the hallway, asking for help locating a family arriving from another floor. Elena apologized politely and excused herself. Adrian watched her disappear into the crowd with the same pleasant smile still resting on his face. Less than 30 seconds later, Raphael stepped into the hallway from the opposite direction. His eyes immediately found Adrian standing beside the donation display. Surprise flickered across Raphael's expression so briefly that almost no one would have noticed it. Adrian turned naturally. "Raphael, I did not expect to see you until the board meeting next week." Raphael approached with measured calm. "Neither did I." Adrian looked toward the reading room. "Beautiful hospital, is it not? Every time I visit, I remember why your family has supported it for so many years." Raphael offered only a slight nod. "Have you been here long?" "Only a few minutes." Adrian smiled. "Long enough to meet the young volunteer everyone keeps talking about." Raphael's gaze drifted briefly toward the white lily in Adrian's pocket before returning to his face. "Miss Bennett leaves quite an impression." "She certainly does," Adrian replied pleasantly. Children trust her immediately. A comfortable silence settled between them, but beneath it rested something far more complicated. Raphael had trusted Adrian's judgment for years. He had helped oversee charitable foundations, hospital partnerships, and countless donations made in Raphael's family's name. There had never been a reason to question him until now. At that exact moment, Elena stood inside the reading room, arranging tomorrow's books when she noticed something unusual tucked inside the return basket. It was not the missing green storybook. It was another much older volume with no title printed across the cover. Curious, she opened it carefully. A small cream-colored envelope slipped onto the table. There was no address, no stamp, only 2 handwritten words across the front in faded blue ink. For Elena. She stared at the envelope in complete confusion. She had never seen it before. She slowly reached toward it just as footsteps approached outside the reading room door, and somewhere down the hallway, Raphael turned his head at exactly the same moment, as though he had sensed that whatever came next would change everything. Elena Bennett hesitated only a second before picking up the cream-colored envelope. The paper felt unusually thick, almost as though it had been preserved for decades rather than months. There was no hospital logo, no return address, and no indication of who had left it inside an untitled book on a cart that only volunteers usually touched. She turned it over once, searching for any clue, but found nothing except the careful handwriting of her own first name. Outside the reading room, footsteps slowed before continuing down the hallway. Whatever interruption she had expected never came. She slid one finger beneath the unsealed flap and carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. It contained only a few lines written in neat blue ink. If you found this, the story was never about the book. Look beneath the place where children always look up. Elena read the sentence twice, then a third time. It sounded more like a riddle than a message. She quietly looked around the reading room. Shelves filled with colorful books surrounded her. Small tables held puzzles and crayons. Hand-painted stars decorated the ceiling above the children's reading circle. Children always looked up. Her eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Tiny paper stars hung from nearly invisible strings, gently swaying beneath the air vents. They had been there for years. She slowly pulled a lightweight step stool from beside the bookshelf and climbed just high enough to examine the nearest decoration. Every star had been handmade by young patients, covered with glitter, stickers, and handwritten wishes. Most simply carried names or drawings. Then she noticed one silver star that looked different from the others. Instead of construction paper, it had been folded from heavier cardstock. A thin piece of clear tape secured it more carefully than the rest. Before she reached toward it, a familiar voice stopped her. "Miss Bennett?" She climbed back down to find Mrs. Holloway standing at the doorway. "There you are," the librarian said with relief. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Elena slipped the folded note into her pocket without thinking. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Holloway nodded. "One of the hospital trustees asked if you could join tomorrow evening's donor reception. They want someone to speak about the children's reading program." Elena looked surprised. "Me? Apparently one of the major benefactors specifically requested you." Elena smiled politely, though uncertainty lingered behind the expression. "I am not much of a public speaker. You speak to frightened children every day," Mrs. Holloway replied warmly. "Adults should be much easier." After the librarian disappeared, Elena looked back toward the silver paper star, but another group of children had already begun arriving for an arts and crafts activity. She decided the decoration could wait until later, less than 2 hallways away. Raphael Castellano listened silently as one of his investigators summarized new information gathered during the afternoon. The unidentified envelope was placed inside the room approximately 15 minutes before Miss Bennett entered. The investigative footage explained quietly asked. One camera was briefly obstructed by a supply cart. Raphael lowered his eyes. Convenient. We also confirmed tomorrow night's donor reception. Nearly every member of the Hospital Foundation Board will attend. Raphael's expression grew thoughtful. Including Adrian Vale? Yes. Raphael looked through the glass wall overlooking the hospital courtyard where volunteers were helping children plant winter flower bulbs in raised planters. Elena knelt among them, laughing as one little boy insisted every flower needed its own name. She appeared completely unaware that multiple people were quietly arranging events around her. "Increase observation," Raphael said calmly, "but do not interfere unless absolutely necessary. Do you believe the reception is connected?" "I believe someone wants Elena exactly where every influential person in this hospital can see her." At almost the same moment, Adrian Vale stood alone inside the hospital chapel. Fresh white lilies lined the altar, filling the quiet room with their delicate fragrance. He adjusted one flower that had tilted slightly in its vase before looking toward the stained glass window above the entrance. A gentle smile crossed his face, thoughtful rather than threatening. "Almost time," he whispered to the empty room. Outside, evening sunlight finally broke through the clouds for the first time all day, sending warm golden light across the pediatric windows. Elena looked up instinctively as the children pointed toward the bright sky. and her attention returned once more to the silver paper star, still hanging quietly above the reading circle, waiting for someone to discover what had been hidden there all along. The next morning arrived with clear skies for the first time all week, and sunlight spilled through the tall windows of St. Agnes Children's Hospital, turning the polished floors into long ribbons of gold. Elena Bennett arrived earlier than usual, hoping to prepare the reading room before the donor reception scheduled for that evening. She carried a fresh stack of picture books beneath one arm and quietly unlocked the small room where dozens of children had laughed, cried, imagined, and healed alongside her stories. Before doing anything else, she looked up. The silver paper star still hung exactly where she had left it the night before. The children would not arrive for another hour. With the room empty, she unfolded the lightweight step-stool once more and carefully climbed until the star rested within reach. The cardstock felt heavier than the others. She gently removed the clear tape securing it to the ceiling string and lowered it into her hands. At first glance, it appeared completely ordinary. Then she noticed that the folded edges had been sealed with an almost invisible strip of transparent paper. She opened it carefully. Inside rested another tiny folded note, no larger than a business card. Her pulse quickened. Written in the same faded blue ink as the previous message were only a few words. Truth survives where kindness remains. Beneath the sentence was a small hand-drawn symbol of a silver flower. Elena stared at it in complete silence. She had expected instructions. Instead, she found another mystery. Before she could study it further, laughter echoed from the hallway as several young patients arrived early for craft time. She quietly slipped the note into the same pocket as the first letter and returned the paper star to its place, careful to leave everything exactly as she had found it. The children rushed inside carrying crayons, coloring books, and handmade paper crowns. Within seconds, the strange discovery gave way to smiles, questions, and excited conversations about dragons, astronauts, and talking penguins. Elena welcomed every child with the same warmth she always had. Watching from outside the glass, Rafael Castellano remained unnoticed. He had arrived before sunrise after receiving confirmation that every decorative star in the reading room had been installed more than 12 years earlier through a memorial program honoring children who had completed treatment. None of the official records mentioned hidden notes. None explained the silver flower symbol. One of his investigators quietly approached. "We've finished reviewing the donor archives." Raphael accepted the folder without taking his eyes off the reading room. "What did you find?" "The memorial program was funded through the Castellano Family Children's Foundation." Raphael nodded slightly. "That part I already knew. There is something else." The investigator opened another document. The original coordinator for the project was Adrian Vale. Raphael's expression did not change, but the silence that followed lasted several seconds. Adrian had supervised the hospital foundation for years. He had approved donations, scholarships, renovations, and nearly every charitable initiative connected to the pediatric wing. If the hidden messages truly dated back to the memorial project, Adrian would almost certainly know they existed. At that exact moment, Adrian himself entered the main lobby carrying a portfolio beneath one arm. Hospital staff greeted him warmly as they prepared for the evening reception. He thanked volunteers by name, complimented seasonal decorations, and paused to admire children's artwork displayed along the corridor. Every gesture appeared effortless, practiced, reassuring. When he noticed Raphael standing near the reading room, he smiled with genuine familiarity. "You are here early," Adrian said. Raphael returned the greeting politely. "I wanted to see how preparations were going." Adrian glanced through the glass toward Eleanor, who was helping a little girl hang a paper snowflake beside the window. "Miss Bennett has become the heart of this place," he observed. "People like her remind donors why hospitals matter." Raphael followed Adrian's gaze but said nothing. He remembered the little note folded inside the silver star. "Truth survives where kindness remains." The sentence no longer sounded like a riddle. It sounded like a warning left by someone who had trusted that compassionate people would eventually uncover what others had tried to hide. Across the room, Elena helped the children arrange chairs into a wide circle for the afternoon reading session. One little boy looked up at the silver paper star and smiled. "That one has always been my favorite," he said. Elena looked toward the decoration, then back at him. "Why that one?" The boy shrugged innocently. "Because my sister said it watches over everyone who reads here." Elena smiled, though the words settled unexpectedly deep inside her. She looked once more at the silver star gently turning beneath the ceiling vent, unaware that by the end of the day, The quiet clues hidden around the reading room would begin fitting together in ways that neither she nor Raphael could have imagined. The donor reception began just after sunset, transforming the main atrium of St. Agnes Children's Hospital into a place filled with quiet conversation, soft piano music, and warm candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Tables displayed photographs of children who had completed treatment, handwritten thank you notes from families, and colorful artwork created inside the pediatric wing. Elena Bennett stood near the entrance wearing the same simple navy dress she reserved for hospital fundraisers every year. She felt slightly out of place among executives, physicians, philanthropists, and community leaders, yet every nurse who passed reminded her that she belonged there as much as anyone else. She had not come to represent money or influence. She had come to represent the children. Rafael Castellano arrived several minutes later. His appearance drew respectful greetings from hospital administrators, but his attention immediately searched the room until he found Elena speaking with a family whose daughter had recently completed treatment. The smile she offered the little girl looked exactly like the one he had first seen through the glass outside the reading room. It was effortless, patient, and completely genuine. For a brief moment he forgot the hidden notes, the missing book, and the questions that had followed both. Then Adrian Vale stepped onto the small stage prepared for the evening program. The room gradually became quiet. Adrian welcomed every guest with calm confidence before speaking about generosity, hope, and the responsibility of caring for children facing impossible circumstances. His words earned warm applause because they reflected everything people wanted to believe about the hospital. Elena listened respectfully, yet she found herself touching the folded notes hidden inside her purse without realizing it. The strange messages had remained in her thoughts all day. Truth survives where kindness remains. The story was never about the book. She still did not understand them, but she no longer believed they were random. After Adrian finished, the hospital director invited Elena to share a few words about the reading program. She hesitated only briefly before walking onto the stage. Bright lights illuminated the room, making it difficult to distinguish individual faces in the audience. She took a slow breath and smiled. Instead of speaking about herself, she spoke about the children who waited for stories after difficult treatments, about parents who smiled for the first time in days when their sons and daughters laughed again, and about how hope often arrived in the form of ordinary moments. By the time she finished, the applause sounded heartfelt rather than formal. Several families wiped away quiet tears. Raphael remained still, watching the audience instead of the stage. He noticed something others missed. As Elena thanked everyone and stepped away from the microphone, Adrian did not applaud immediately. His eyes briefly shifted toward the ceiling above the ballroom where decorative silver stars, copied from those in the pediatric reading room, had been suspended as part of the evening's theme. The expression lasted only a second before disappearing behind another polite smile. Raphael remembered the folded silver star in the reading room. He remembered the hidden note inside it. The similarity was too precise to dismiss. At that exact moment, one of Raphael's investigators quietly approached from the side entrance, carrying a slim folder. Without interrupting the event, he slipped it into Raphael's hand and stepped away again. Inside were copies of Foundation records recovered from an archived storage cabinet earlier that afternoon. Several memorial donations had been approved under Adrian Vale's supervision more than a decade before. Attached to the final page was a handwritten inventory describing decorative stars installed throughout the children's wing. One entry stood apart from the rest. Silver commemorative star, privately requested. Placement approved by Adrian Vale. Raphael closed the folder slowly. Across the room, Elena accepted warm congratulations from nurses and volunteers before glancing toward the ballroom ceiling. Dozens of silver stars shimmered gently beneath the lights. One looked slightly different from the others, hanging just above the display featuring children's handwritten wishes. Without fully understanding why, she quietly walked toward it. The silver paper caught the light as though inviting her closer. She reached up, noticing that the edge had begun to loosen slightly, revealing the faint outline of another folded piece of paper hidden inside. Before she could touch it, Raphael arrived beside her. He spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Do not open it here." Elena looked at him with quiet surprise. "You knew it was there?" Raphael held her gaze for a moment before answering. "I hoped there would be another one." Neither of them noticed Adrian watching from across the ballroom with the same composed expression he had worn all evening. Only his eyes lingered on the silver star for a fraction longer than necessary, as though he understood exactly what it contained and silently wondered who would read it first. When the final guests began leaving the reception, the hospital slowly returned to the peaceful rhythm Elena Bennett knew so well. Volunteers gathered centerpieces, nurses resumed their evening rounds, and the soft music that had filled the atrium faded into silence. The silver star still hung above the display, catching the last traces of warm light from the chandeliers. Rafael Castellano waited until the room had nearly emptied before carefully removing the decoration. Instead of opening it in the ballroom, he handed it to Elena. "You should read it," he said quietly. She unfolded the paper with steady hands. Inside was another handwritten note, shorter than the others. The greatest gift was never hidden inside these pages. It was hidden inside the people who protected them. Folded beneath the note rested a thin piece of archival paper listing donations made to St. Agnes Children's Hospital over many years. Every contribution had funded pediatric care, family housing, children's libraries, and treatment assistance. Near the bottom of the page was one final handwritten instruction directing future readers to compare the records with the hospital's official foundation archive. The following morning, hospital administrators carefully reviewed the documents alongside preserved financial records. The comparison revealed a series of accounting errors that had quietly diverted charitable funds away from the children's programs years earlier. They were not dramatic discoveries, but they were important enough to trigger a full independent audit. Over the weeks that followed, the discrepancies were corrected, oversight procedures were strengthened, and every dollar identified through the old records was restored to the pediatric programs for which generous families had originally intended them. Adrian Vale stepped away from his leadership role while the review was completed, expressing his willingness to cooperate fully with the process. The hospital board thanked everyone who had helped preserve the forgotten records, recognizing that quiet honesty had accomplished what suspicion alone never could. Elena never considered herself a hero. She had simply followed one small clue after another because something inside her believed that kindness deserved the truth. The children, of course, cared far less about audits than they did about the newly expanded reading room that opened several months later. Fresh shelves lined the walls, comfortable chairs replaced worn furniture, sunlight poured through larger windows overlooking the hospital garden. At the entrance, a simple bronze plaque read, "Stories give hope, hope gives strength." No individual names appeared beneath the inscription. That had been Raphael's decision. He insisted the room belonged to every child who walked through its doors. On the first morning after the renovation, Elena carried a familiar stack of books into the new reading space. The old green storybook was never found again, yet somehow its absence no longer felt like a loss. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. The hidden notes had protected something far more valuable than paper and ink. They had protected the promise that compassion would outlast secrecy. One by one, children gathered around Elena exactly as they always had. Some were returning patients. Others were visiting for the very first time. Their questions remained wonderfully ordinary. "What are we reading today?" one little boy asked eagerly. Elena smiled and opened a new story. "Today we are reading about a garden where every season begins with hope." Laughter filled the room before the first page was even turned. Raphael arrived quietly a few minutes later. There were no advisors surrounding him, no urgent phone calls, and no reason to stand hidden behind glass anymore. He chose a chair near the back of the room where he could see the children without interrupting them. Elena noticed him only briefly before continuing the story. This time she did not wonder why he had come. She already knew. Some people protected hospitals with donations. Others protected them with careful leadership. She protected them with stories. None of those acts mattered more than the others. Together they created something no mystery could ever hide. As Elena read, sunlight drifted across the children's faces, replacing the cold reflections of fluorescent lights that had filled the room on the night everything began. Raphael listened in complete silence, no longer searching for hidden messages inside old books or secret compartments beneath worn bindings. The greatest message had never been concealed in paper at all. It had been sitting in front of him every evening, disguised as a woman who believed frightened children deserved one more chapter before bedtime. Outside, the hospital garden bloomed beneath the first days of spring, and inside the reading room, the sound of children laughing rose gently toward the ceiling where a single silver paper star had been placed once again, not to guard a secret, but to remind everyone who looked up that hope becomes strongest when it is shared.